Letters from a Friend at the End of the World. Chapter 14. Old Friends and New. Chill wind blew about her face as Twilight stepped outside. She glanced over her shoulder and saw a sleepy-eyed Spike covering his yawning mouth with one claw. He noticed Twilight looking at him and said, "Did we really have to leave so early? It's not even light out yet." He leaned forward and laid his head against Twilight's neck. "Let's just go back to sleep for a few more hours."
"Aw, it's poor little Spike, Sweepy,"
said Rainbow Dash in a mock baby voice. She was standing next to Twilight with a silly grin spread across her face. She nudged Spike's side with one foreleg.
"You can't sleep all day, Spiky boy."
She unfurled her wings in one fluid motion, spreading them out like an umbrella. With a few powerful strokes, she lifted herself several feet into the air and gazed skyward. Looking back down at Spike, she said,
"We've got a mysterious mare to find."
Without so much as another word, she began to beat her wings and shoot upwards, leaving Spike no chance for rebuttal. Twilight watched with detached interest as Rainbow Dash soared into the still dark sky, briefly silhouetted as she passed in front of the dawning sun that was rising just past the mountains.
"Largo said the pony we're looking for lives just past the west side of town, about a 3-hour walk from here. He said that she's gone frequently, so leaving earlier is the best chance of catching her."
Yeah, I know," Spike grumbled. "But couldn't you have just teleported us there? We could have slept in a little longer that way." He sighed wistfully. "I could be all warm and cozy right now." Twilight watched as Rainbow Dash did loops in the sky, leaving a rainbow trail behind her. She flew through a couple smaller clouds, bursting them apart with a silent explosion. Taking her eyes off Rainbow, she trotted westward up the street.
"Teleportation doesn't work that way, Spike. You should know that. Didn't you read the book I gave you for your birthday last year? Teleportation, Psychokinetics, and Other Unicorn Magic?"
Spike yawned again. "I must have missed that one," he said, nuzzling his head against Twilight's. "I get so many books from you, sometimes I just can't find time to read them all." Twilight thought she could detect a hint of sarcasm in his voice, but she ignored it, writing it off as a figment of her imagination.
"Well," she said matter-of-factly, "if you had read it, you would know that blind teleportation is extremely dangerous and can lead to fatal splicing if performed imprecisely." She glanced up to make sure that Rainbow Dash was still overhead and saw that she'd already managed to pick a fight with someone. She had her forehead splayed out and her wings were flapping angrily. It looked like the Pegasus that Rainbow Dash was arguing with, a rather small stallion with overly large yellowish wings, was probably part of the weather crew, given that he was pointing fiercely at the clouds Rainbow had just destroyed. Twilight shook her head inwardly. Rainbow always seems to cause trouble wherever she went. But, she supposed, that was an integral part of what made her who she is. And she wouldn't change that for anything. She just hoped that Rainbow Dash could see that about Trixie. Curious and oblivious to Twilight's sky-gazing, Spike asked, "What do you mean, blind teleportation? And what's splicing?" He sat up. "That doesn't sound like a good thing." Twilight chuckled. "Well, no, it's really not a good thing."
As she continued walking, she lifted a twig from the ground and levitated it above her head, so Spike could see.
"See," she began, "when you perform a teleportation spell, you imagine the place you want to teleport to inside your head, kind of like you were drawing a picture. You have to do this because if you don't, you could end up anywhere, or even worse, nowhere."
Spike watched as the twig, surrounded by a magenta light, disappeared in a flash of light and reappeared a few inches to the right. "What do you mean, nowhere?"
"I can teleport this stick because I can picture where it's going. But if I were to attempt to teleport it without picturing a place, then it could end up anywhere, or perhaps disappear entirely."
The twig flashed white again, but this time didn't reappear. Twilight looked over her shoulder at Spike, her face serious.
"This is why teleportation magic is so rarely used, and so dangerous. Only a few unicorns can even manage it, and the reason I know it is because I was Celestia's student. They would never have taught us this in ordinary magic school."
She turned back to the street, now noticing that the early morning light had begun to creep over the small town. All the shops and homes and market stalls were bathed in a soft, dark orange light. She could hear ponies begin to stir in their homes, the occasional rattle of a door closing or the telltale trickle of a faucet being turned on. This sleepy little town was beginning to wake, and soon would be bustling with activity. "So," Spike said slowly, "what happened to that twig just a second ago? Where did it go?"
"I can't answer that, Spike."
"What? Why not?"
"Because I don't know where it went."
They were nearing the edge of the town now. She could see where the stone path turned into a dirt one about a quarter mile up the road.
"As far as I know, Spike, no pony knows what happens when you do a blind teleportation. Maybe the twig just ended up in the middle of the ocean somewhere, or maybe it's back in the forest." She shrugged. "For all I know, it disappeared entirely, ceased to exist."
Spike whistled softly. "Whoa, So, like, if you did that to some pony, would it kill them? Twilight shook her head. Not necessarily. It might just send them somewhere random, or maybe even to another dimension. Is that possible? It's magic, Spike. Anything is possible. For a few minutes they trotted along in silence. Occasionally Twilight would look up and see Rainbow Dash still arguing with that poor stallion. She was sure Rainbow must have talked his ears off already. It was a wonder he was still able to continue arguing with her. Eventually, he shook his head and flew off, leaving a thoroughly pleased-looking Rainbow Dash behind. With a smug look on her face and a joyful beat of her wings, she soared down towards them. As she gently glided downwards, Spike remembered something. "Oh yeah," he said suddenly. "You said something about splicing before, but you never said what it was." He watched Rainbow descend towards them, the light of the new sun showering her in an almost regal light. "I get the feeling that's not something you want to happen."
"Well, we did establish that it was not a good thing," Twilight chuckled. "Basically, it's when— Man, this feels so good to be right!"
Rainbow shouted, interrupting Twilight. She was just a few dozen feet above them, and falling fast, pulling out of her dive in time to land, then skidding and halt in front of Twilight and Spike.
"These Emerald Fall weather Pegasi think they know more about clouds than me."
She laughed derisively, ignoring Twilight's attempt to speak, and Spike's raised eyebrows. She continued on.
"That dude told me that I shouldn't be doing any cloud busting because they were scheduled to have it overcast today. But those were cumulus clouds. Rain clouds, Twilight."
She shook her head, laughing even more.
"If I hadn't bursted those suckers up, then they would have had more than a little overcast today. That dude should have been thanking me. That's free weather service right there, provided by Rainbow Dash, weathermare extraordinaire."
She puffed at her chest proudly, but only received an exaggerated eye rolls in return.
"Even if you're right, Rainbow," Twilight said calmly, "you still shouldn't be messing around with other towns' weather. It's not your place to do that."
Rainbow Dash waved her hoof dismissively.
"Pfft, whatever. I did that dude's job for him. He's probably got, like, tons of free time now."
She curled her wings against her chest and tossed her mane out of her eyes.
"They should call me the element of generosity," she said jokingly.
Spike and Twilight exchanged glances, head shakes, and more eye rolls.
"Anyway, Spike," Twilight said, "like I was saying, splicing is when— Splicing?"
Rainbow Dash asked, cocking her head to the side and interrupting Twilight yet again.
"What's that? Sounds kind of cool." "As I was about to explain to Spike," Twilight said, slightly annoyed, "splicing is anything but cool." She spat the word cool out like it had insulted her. "Teleportation can be extremely dangerous, especially if an inexperienced unicorn attempts it. Like I said before, the subject can end up anywhere, or, if focus is lost during the casting, only part of the subject will be teleported."
Spike scratched his head. "So wait, are you saying what I think you're saying?" Rainbow Dash's eyes lit up.
"Whoa! Like, if you tried to teleport somewhere and you messed up, you could, like, lose a leg or something?" "Yes. Or worse," Twilight replied dryly. "Again, this is only why a few unicorns have ever been taught how to teleport, and even fewer use it regularly like me."
She tilted her head thoughtfully.
"Come to think of it, I don't know of anyone who can teleport. I mean, I'm sure Celestia and Luna can, but I've never seen them do it." "Huh.
Alright, so I guess teleporting's out of the question, huh?" Spike said. "Guess we're walking."
"Hold the phone,"
Rainbow Dash said, holding out her foot.
"You can teleport us to this mayor's house, Twi? Why don't we just do that?"
Twilight shook her head in disbelief, and Spike just stared at Rainbow, his mouth slightly open. Sighing, Twilight said,
"Come on, let's get going. We still got a decent walk ahead of us."
Rainbow Dash watched them walk away, her head cocked sideways.
"Are you saying we're not just gonna poof over there?" "Come on, Rainbow," Twilight called over her shoulder. "Man, walking sucks."
After a few hours of walking, and more than just a little grumbling from Rainbow Dash, they had reached their destination, a dilapidated old shack that was a little off the trail that led back towards Emerald Falls. It was nestled in a small grove, covered in vines that ran down like snakes across its wooden surface, and surrounded by tall trees. They were standing in a small clearing just in front of it. It seemed to be in a sort of garden area. Only the plants grew there were unlike any that Twilight had ever seen. They were bizarre and twisted, with sharp growths poking out of some, or colorful, ominous-looking flowers protruding from others. It was the kind of garden that Twilight was sure Zecora would have had a field day with.
"It's too bad she's not here," lamented Twilight. "I'm pretty sure she could help us. She always seems to know what to do."
She sighed softly.
"I wonder what she's up to right now. Probably making some new potion or something. Maybe I should go and talk to her when we get back. I'd like to catch up with her. It's been so long." "You know," Dash said suddenly, bringing Twilight out of her thoughts, "as much as I love standing in front of creepy houses with weird gardens, maybe we should knock and see if anyone's home. I mean, don't get me wrong, I could sit here and look at this," she pointed at a black flower, "all day. But with Trixie being in imminent danger and all, maybe it's best we hurry this whole operation along."
Spike laughed. "Since when do you care so much about Trixie?"
"I don't. she shot back, her eyes glowing angrily. I just want to get the heck out of here. This place is giving me the creeps like you wouldn't believe. She looked around cautiously. Something's seriously up with this place. Like, something weird. Twilight smiled comfortingly. Don't be silly, Rainbow. I'm sure there's nothing to be afraid of. Afraid? Who said I was afraid? I'm just a little, creeped out, you know? Anyway, where is this mare? Twilight peered into the window, holding one hoof over her eyes to block out the light. She saw a cramped little room filled with bottles and basket and filled with Celestia knows what. There was a small fire burning beneath an iron cauldron in the back of the room, but it was otherwise unlit. If she strained her eyes, she could almost see something hanging down from the ceiling. It looked kind of like a string of bones. She backed away, removing her hoof. It doesn't look like she's in there, she said. Plus, I'm pretty sure she would have heard us by now if she were. She sighed, turning back to Rainbow and Spike. With a shrug of her shoulders, she says, I guess we'll have to wait for her to get back. Rainbow shook her head vigorously, unfurling her wings and lifting into the air. Nuh-uh, there is no way I'm staying here to wait for some creepy old witch that we aren't even sure lives here. Twilight's lips curled into a sly smile. I thought you weren't scared. I'm not. I'm just... Don't look at me like that. Twilight covered her mouth to stifle her giggling. Good thing you're not the element of courage, she joked. Otherwise, we might... Rainbow's hoof moved over Twilight's mouth, cutting her off. Twilight pushed it out of the way with her own hoof. I'm sorry, Dash. It was just a joke. She pressed her hoof against her lips, shushing Twilight. Shh, she whispered. I think I hear some pony. Spike hurried over to them, whispering, What is it? What's going on? Twilight looked down at him, eyes wide. Rainbow said she heard somebody, but I don't. Rainbow held up a hoof, silencing her. Quiet, she said. Listen, you can hear two ponies from not too far from here. They stood silently, straining their ears. Twilight and Spike heard nothing, but Dash, on the other hand, seemed to be listening intently, as if she were eavesdropping on some far-off conversation. Her head was turned so that her right ear was facing back toward the row, and her eyes were narrowed in concentration. It sounds like they're arguing. Something about... Hold on. She leaned a little farther forward. Suddenly, her eyes widened and then narrowed again. She relaxed her muscles and leaned back and chuckled. Give me a sec, she said before Twilight could ask what happened. Rainbow was already flying back toward the road. Twilight cocked her head to the side. Well, that was weird. Yeah, Spike agreed. I wonder what's up with her. She shrugged. Must have had something to do with what she heard, I guess. They waited patiently for a minute or so for Dash to return, their eyes trained on the trail leading to the clearing. Eventually, they could hear the familiar sound of hooves against dirt, and the rustling of bushes not far away. As the sounds got louder, they began to hear voices with them. I just don't know how the heck we're supposed to find the place if it's out in the middle of the woods. It's not like there's some sign or something saying, Come on over, witch house this way. Dear, I think you may be taking this rather personally. If we had simply stopped back when I said we should, we could have asked for directions and then we wouldn't be in this predicament, now would we? Now look here, Missy. I don't know about you, but I've been around here a few times. I know what I'm doing when it comes to navigating and such. It ain't my fault that this place ain't got the beaten path. Heck, it ain't got any path for that matter. Still, though, Twilight would have found it if Rainbow hadn't gone and found us, so I guess you could be right. Heck, yeah, if it weren't for me, you guys still be lost. Lucky for you, Rainbow Dash, navigational extraordinaire, is here to save the day. Even though she couldn't see them, Twilight knew that Applejack and Rarity were rolling their eyes right now, probably because she was doing the same. Meanwhile, she just heard a simple, ugh, from Spike. About 10 seconds later, a trio of ponies came crashing through the underbrush, Rainbow leading them with her head held high like she was leading an army into battle. Applejack was right behind her. Her hat, covered in leaves, nettles, and vine, was in her hoof being cleaned with her mouth. She would delicately bite a vine and toss it aside every few steps. Behind her, Rarity somehow managed to look elegant even while tromping through the woods. Her hoof steps were light and dainty, like she was walking through a glass house. As they entered the clearing, Dash lifted into the air and put her hooves at her sides, sucking in her stomach. She waved a hoof behind her. Ta-da! Look what I found, Twi, she said proudly. Looks like we weren't the only ones looking for this creepy place. Noticing the house for the first time, Rarity was taken back. My, it does have a certain air about it, does it not? Dash nodded. Yeah, like creepy air or something. Like I told Twi, this place gives me the heebie-jeebies, something fierce. Applejack, after spitting out the last leaf, placed her hat back on her head and said, This place don't look so bad to me. Might need a little TLC, and a flamethrower, but it looks right down cozy if you ask me. Twilight laughed. I don't know if I'd go that far, but it certainly has a certain charm to it, I must say. She glanced over her shoulder at the still empty house. Looking back at AJ and Rarity, she said, "Anyway, what are you girls doing way out here? Shouldn't you be back in Ponyville?" Applejack opened her mouth about to respond, but Rarity quickly cut her off. "Well, yes, dear, I was looking for some emeralds for my new design, and I thought, what better place to find emeralds than Emerald Falls, no?" "And she calling me into going with her," said Applejack bitterly. "Should have known there weren't no apple convention I never heard of." Rarity glanced around shiftily, playing with her mane. "Regardless of how I, convinced dear Applejack to join me, we eventually found ourselves scouring the town in search of emeralds. To my great dismay, not a single shop sold the ones I was looking for. Can you believe it?" "Breaks my heart thinking about it," said Applejack, shaking her head lightly. "A real crying shame." Ignoring her, Rarity continued, "In any case, it appears that the soulstone emeralds are exceedingly rare, even in these parts. But the little sweet talk and no small amount of perseverance, I was able to ascertain where I could find soulstone emeralds." "Basically, some stallion we met at a pub, Logger I think his name was, told us that this here witch, or whatever, might have something she'd be willing to part with. Of course, then we had to find the darn place, which obviously took a little longer than we'd anticipated." She glanced at Rarity. "And that's the long and short of it, Twi." Twilight let out a quiet sigh. "Well, I guess that explains that." "Indeed," said Rarity. "But it doesn't explain why you girls are out here." Spike and Rainbow Dash let out a collective groan. "Trust me, Rarity," said Spike. "You don't want to know. It's a long story." "Yeah," added Dash, "and one that involves Trixie, too." She lowered herself to the ground and placed a hoof around Rarity's shoulders. "Like Spike said, it's a long story. You don't want to hear it." As soon as Dash had said Trixie, Applejack's curiosity had been more than whetted. She held up a hoof, pushing Rainbow away. "Now hang on a minute, Dash. Rarity here might not want to hear this, but I do. What's all this about Trixie now? What's she got to do with you being way out here?" Rarity's eyes lit up. Yes, I'm quite interested as well. I can't for the life of me be able to figure out what reason you could possibly have to be out here to do with that beast who destroyed my beautiful mane." She pulled her mane up and down in front of her eyes. "It took me nearly 3 days to get it back to this color. What could this have to do with that ruffian?" "Well," Twilight said slowly, trailing off. Before she could continue her thought, a loud, ear-piercing roar rocketed to the woods, shaking the trees and raining leaves down upon them. Said Spike. "What was that?" "Probably not good," Twilight replied. They waited for a moment, then heard another roar, loud as the first, echo through the forest, followed by a much quieter, though still loud, scream. All 5 of them turned to face the sound, their eyes widening. "Do you girls think we could finish this discussion another time?" They all nodded in unison. Without another word, Twilight grabbed Spike with her magic and tossed him onto her back. They tore off into the woods, following behind Applejack and Rarity, who were leading the way with Rainbow Dash overhead. As they went deeper and deeper into the woods, the sound grew louder and louder. They followed the screams as best they could, adjusting their path on the fly. They leapt over bushes and ducked under branches, nearing ever closer to the source of roars. Once, Applejack nearly tripped over a rock, but Twilight and Rarity were able to catch her without stopping, and soon they were back on their way. Twilight looked up and saw Rainbow Dash dive downwards. She knew that they must be close. A few seconds later, they reached a clearing in the woods. They didn't know how deep they'd come, but they'd run for at least a minute. Lying on her back with a massive chimera looming over her, a mare was holding up all 4 hooves. One of them, Twilight thought, looked peculiar, almost like it was made of metal. She was pushing against the beast, but was unable to keep it from pressing down even harder. From nowhere above the trees, Rainbow Dash crashed through the branches and flew straight at the chimera's side. With one leg extended outwards, she rocketed toward it, some kind of flying kick attack. She crashed into it with all the force of a hurricane and caused it to tumble backwards. The mare quickly picked herself up and shot a glance at them, and then up to Rainbow. "Thank you for the help." As she turned back to the chimera, she said, "Perhaps you'd be willing to offer a little more."